Welcome everyone. This is the second module on land rental contracts. As we have learned from the earlier module that theoretically fixed rent contract is the most efficient form of contract. But despite of it being the most efficient form of contract, in reality sharecropping dominates the land contract. So, in this module, we shall at first try to find out why sharecropping is the most dominant form of contract. For this, we shall at first find out the impact of risk preference of tenants and landlords on land tenancy contract. This will be done with particular emphasis on sharecropping. Then, we shall also try to find out how tenancy contracts can act as a screening device and how it justifies the existence of sharecropping. So, let us enter into our discussion by asking a question which was raised in the earlier module. Fixed rent contract is more efficient compared to sharecropping. Still, sharecropping is the most popular form of contract. Why is it so? To find the answer, let us start with the first explanation. This explanation is based on risk considerations. Now, if we remember our initial discussion on the first module, then we would find that there landowners and tenants, they were assumed to be risk neutral. That means they were assumed to care only about their expected return. However, in reality, both the landowners as well as the tenants can be risk averse. To start our analysis, let us begin with the case where tenants are risk averse while the landowners are risk neutral. Let us for the time being assume that agricultural production is uncertain and it has two possible states of return, a good state and a bad state. The good state produces an output represented by capital G. The bad state produces an output represented by capital B, and obviously G is greater than B. Let us further assume that P be the probability of occurrence of good state. So, given these assumptions, let us now try to compare between the fixed rent contract and sharecropping. Let us start with the fixed rent contract. Suppose capital R represents the amount of fixed rent that goes to the landowner. So, in this situation, if good state occurs, then the tenant receives capital G minus capital R. On the other hand, if bad state occurs, then the tenant receives capital B minus capital R. But what happens in case of sharecropping? Suppose small s represents the share going to the landowner. So, in good state, the landowner will get small s times G. In case of bad state, the landowner will get small s times B. Therefore, the expected return of the landowner can be represented as P times small sg plus 1 minus P times small sb. What happens to the tenants? If good state occurs, then the tenant receives 1 minus s proportion of capital G, while if bad state occurs, the tenant receives 1 minus s proportion of capital B. Therefore, the expected return of tenants can be described as P times 1 minus S multiplied by G plus 1 minus P times 1 minus S into B. Now, given these possible payoffs, let us consider the situation where both fixed rent contracts and sharecropping exist side by side. Now, this can happen if the return to the landlords from sharecropping and from fixed rent contract remains the same. The return to the landowner will remain the same if P times SG plus 1 minus P times SB equals R. So, this is the situation where the landowner will remain indifferent between the two forms of contracts. Now, from this equation, we get a specified value of small s, which is capital R by P times G plus 1 minus P times B. Now, given this value of S, let us find out the excess return from sharecropping. Now, what is the excess return from sharecropping? It is the amount of return from sharecropping minus the amount of return from fixed rent contract. And here we are finding out the excess return of sharecropping of the tenants. Now, if we consider the case of the excess return in sharecropping of the tenants, then in good state, the tenant will receive 1 minus S proportion of G minus G minus R. In bad state, the tenant will receive 1 minus S into B minus B minus R. Now, if we put the value of S here, we find that in case of good state, the excess return becomes negative, while in the bad state, the excess return becomes positive. Now, if this is the case, then this in turn means that sharecropping lowers the return in good state but increase the return in bad state. Now, if this is the case, then what is its implication for the dominance of sharecropping? Now, sharecropping can be justified in this way that the risk-averse tenants, to protect themselves from the downside risk, can prefer sharecropping. So, the dominance of sharecropping can be explained in terms of the attempt of the tenants to protect themselves from the downside risk. Now, if this is the case, then again we can ask a particular question. If tenants are actually risk averse, then why they do not opt for fixed wage contract? Fixed wage contract always gives them a fixed amount of return. So why not fixed wage contract? Why sharecropping? There are two possible explanations for the dominance of sharecropping. The first explanation is based on risk preference. See, so far we have assumed that the landowner is risk neutral. But there is high chance that the landowner can be risk averse as well. So, if the landowner is risk averse, then fixed wage contract will transfer all the risk to the landowners. So if this is the case, then why should a risk-averse landowner accept a contract which transfers the entire amount of risk to herself? Therefore, from the point of view of risk aversion, it can be said that the risk averse landowners may not be ready to accept fixed wage contract. Therefore, the fixed wage contract may be considered inferior when compared to sharecropping. The second explanation, on the other hand, is based on the incentive problem related to the effort of the tenant. As we all know that the effort of a tenant is related to the gains from providing additional effort. Now, what happens in case of sharecropping? In case of sharecropping, a part of the benefit of higher production goes to the tenants. So, the tenant has the incentive to provide higher effort. What happens in case of fixed wage contract? In fixed wage contract, no return goes to the tenant for her extra effort. So if this is the case, then what should be the incentive to the tenant to provide higher effort? There is a high chance that in case of fixed wage contract, the tenant will provide comparatively lower effort compared to the case of sharecropping. So from this, we can say that unless there is a system of direct supervision, landowners will not be willing to hire tenants with fixed wages. So this explains why fixed wage contract is not a popular form of contract. So if fixed wage contract is not a popular form of contract, and if on the other hand sharecropping becomes the most popular form of contract, then as we all know that sharecropping has some incentive related problems. So sharecropping is considered to be comparatively inefficient. So the question arises in this context that as sharecropping has some efficiency related problems, then if we observe that it is the most dominant form of contract, then how can we solve the efficiency related problem inherent in sharecropping? One possible solution methodology for the inefficiency related problem is like this: if the input cost is observable, as it seems generally to be, then the landowner can share input costs in accordance to the share of output. Now, what does it mean? This means that if small s represents the share of output demanded by the landowner, then small s should also be the share of input cost to be borne by the landowner. Now, what will be its implication? To find its implication, let us consider two separate situations. The first situation is that situation where there is no share of input cost on part of landowners. Now, if the landowners do not share any input cost, then the optimal decision for the sharecropper will be to produce up to the point where the effective marginal return to the sharecropper, which is actually 1 minus s times the actual marginal product, to be equal to the marginal cost. On the other hand, if the landowner shares S proportion of the input cost, then at optimal, the sharecropper's effective marginal product will be 1 minus S times the actual marginal product. At the same time, the effective marginal cost will be 1 minus S times the actual marginal cost. Now, equating them in terms means equating the marginal product with the marginal cost. So, in the situation where the landowner shares a proportion of the marginal cost which is equal to the value S, the sharecropping contract becomes an optimum contract. So, in this situation, there is no inefficiency related problem in sharecropping, and hence sharecropping becomes an efficient form of contract. Now, let us move to the second explanation in favor of the presence of sharecropping. This explanation is related to the ability differences and screening. Suppose there is a single landowner who owns 2 pieces of land. Also assume that there are 2 tenants with differing abilities. One tenant has higher ability and the other tenant has lower ability. The higher ability is expressed in terms of the capacity to produce output, and in case of high ability, this capacity is equal to Q1. On the other hand, the low capacity tenant will be capable to produce output Q2, which is obviously less than Q1. The problem in this case will be that the contract between the landowner and the tenant have to be made before production, but the ability can be observed only after the production is performed. So, while making the contract, the ability of the tenants are unobservable. However, we are making 2 simplistic assumptions. The first assumption is that the tenant has a reservation output level Y bar. Now, this in turn implies that the tenant will accept the tenancy contract only if she gets a return at least equal to Y bar. At the same time, let us assume that for every possible output level Qi, the value of Qi is greater than Y bar. This means that some amount of output will go to the landowners in every possible situation. Now, this will actually incentivize the landowner to enter into land contracts. Now, given this situation, let us at first start with the analysis of a situation where the landowner knows everybody's ability. So, landowner can effectively find out who is high ability tenant and who is low ability tenant. So, what will happen in this case? In this case, the landowner has the ability to charge R1 to the high quality tenant and R2 to the high ability tenant in such a way that Q1 minus R1 and Q2 minus R2 are both equal to Y bar. Now, if we instead adhere to sharecropping, similar arrangement can be made by choosing the values of shares alpha 1 and alpha 2 in such a way that alpha 1 Q1 and alpha 2 Q2 equals to Y bar. So, in this case, the landowner will be indifferent between 2 forms of contracts. But what is happening in reality? In reality, the ability is unobservable. So the landowners can opt for three types of contracts. The first option will be to charge R1 for high ability tenant and R2 for low ability tenant, where R1 is greater than R2. So high ability tenant have to pay a higher amount of fixed rent, while the low ability tenant will have to pay a low amount of fixed rent. Now what will happen in this situation? As the landowner do not know who is high ability tenant and who is low ability tenant, so there is high chance that every tenant will pretend to be of less ability and try to pay R2. What is the next option? The next option to the landowner is to charge everyone high rent, that is R1. Now what will happen in this situation? If the landowner charges R1 to both the tenants, then there is a high chance that only high ability tenant will enter into the contract. So in this situation, the low ability tenant will not enter into the contract, and therefore a part of the land will remain uncultivated. So this type of option also seems to be some sort of problematic. Now let us move to the third option. Let us define the third option in this way, that landowner offers a particular combination of fixed rent and share contract, RS alpha S, and offers the tenant to choose any one of them. This means that the landlord goes to the tenants and tell them that you can either accept fixed rent tenancy or you can accept sharecropping. Now, if you accept fixed rent tenancy, then you have to pay me RS. On the other hand, if you accept sharecropping, then give me alpha S proportion of the total output. Now, what will happen in this case? Suppose the ith tenant chooses fixed rent contract and the jth tenant chooses fixed share contract. Now, as the ith tenant chooses fixed rent contract, the tenant must choose it because her return in case of fixed rent contract must exceed that of sharecropping. So this condition is given by Qi minus Rs to be greater than equal to 1 minus alpha S of Qi. The jth individual is choosing fixed share contract. Now this will happen if Qj minus Rs, that is the return from fixed rent contract, is less than 1 minus alpha S into Qj. Now if we equate these two terms, we get Qi alpha S to be greater than Rs and Qj alpha S to be less than Rs. Now these two conditions in turn imply that Qi must be greater than or equal to Qj. Now as we have assumed earlier, this implies Qi must be equal to Q1 while Qj must be equal to Q2. In other words, the individual with higher ability will choose a fixed rent contract while the individual with lower ability will choose sharecropping. Now the implication of this for the dominance of sharecropping can be explained in this way: if an economy is dominated by low ability tenants, sharecropping will be the dominant form of contract. So what we get from our discussion can be summarized in this way, that risk aversion on part of both tenants and landlords lead to the dominance of sharecropping. At the same time, another possible reason for the dominance of sharecropping can be the difference in the ability of tenants with the low quality tenants dominating the market. At the same time, we have also observed that the inefficiency inherent in sharecropping can be reduced if policies like cost sharing are undertaken. So, this is what we have for this module. Thanks for watching.